Good afternoon, everyone. You're all very welcome to our AWARE webinar today. Today, we're going to be looking at the mental health impacts of loneliness. My name is Dr. Susan Brannick. I'm Clinical Director here at AWARE, and really happy to be joined for the second time with Dr. Emma Kirwan, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Galway. So we'll take a moment or two, as we always do, just to allow people to filter in. So just taking a moment to get comfortable, and we'll get going very shortly. So welcome again to those joining. For those who've just joined, to introduce myself again. So I'm Dr. Susan Brannick and joined this afternoon by Dr. Emma Kirwan, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Galway. And this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the mental health impact of loneliness. So just as people are kind of arriving in, just a little bit of a note on our webinars for those who may not be so familiar with them. So we meet every second Wednesday of the month to talk about a whole range of topics related to mental health, depression, anxiety, and bipolar. So you can find more information on our website and certainly for past recordings as well. You can also find information on our website about our education programs. They're open for registration this week. So do have a look if you're interested in CBT informed programs to help with mood and anxiety. We also have a counselling service that's free of charge. So have a look on our website for that, as well as our support services. And just, I guess, a note on our topic today. So we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can. So please do put in questions as we're speaking. If you're left with anything that's remaining kind of around your own mental health or concerns, really just kind of encouraging you to speak to your GP or mental health professional, or kind of seeking a bit of time after this webinar as well for self-care. So without further ado, Emma, you're very welcome back. So we would have met, I think, was it maybe a year and a half ago you might have been on?
Yeah,
with Anne-Marie,
about 2 years ago, maybe, yeah.
2 years, yeah, time goes quick. So welcome again, Emma. Thanks so much for joining us. Do you want to give a little short introduction about yourself and maybe a bit about how you got into this work, if that's okay?
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much for having me back, Susan. So as you mentioned, I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Galway, and I'm working on projects really, I suppose, about engaging public with research across Evidence Synthesis Ireland and the HRB Trials Research Methodology Network. But research-wise, I suppose I'm interested mostly in the psychological and the social factors that impact our health and well-being, and particularly loneliness. And I got into this area through my PhD research on loneliness in young or emerging adulthood. And I suppose what really fascinates me about loneliness is how deeply individual the experience of loneliness is. So hopefully we'll get into this in a couple of minutes, but I suppose two people can be in very similar situations but feel really different about their social connections, and that makes the research challenging, but it's also really interesting. Yeah, so I'm delighted to be here to chat to you today about that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I guess a really helpful place to start, isn't it? As you said, that it can be really different for different people. And I guess that's going to be shaped by your past experiences and kind of how you might relate to yourself, your kind of relationships with other people as well. So there's going to be loads of different layers to it probably. So a lot of areas to research, which is good. Well, maybe even starting with kind of what is loneliness, because maybe we don't all share the same idea of what that is.
Yeah, so I think that is a good place to start, I suppose, with defining what we mean when we say loneliness. So loneliness is most commonly defined as an unpleasant, or it's a distressing, subjective feeling of being disconnected or feeling disconnected or perceiving that you're isolated from others. And that can be even if you're surrounded by people. And I think a really good place to start when we're trying to understand loneliness is to differentiate between that and being alone, which might be better described as social isolation. And often these two things can get confused. But I could look at another person and count how many interactions with people that they have in a day. So maybe they have a phone call with a friend or a conversation with somebody in the shop. And that's how socially isolated they are, which is more about having very few people in your social network. But then for loneliness, I suppose what's key about loneliness is that we can't look at other people and tell how lonely they are. It's more the internal idea or a judgment that we have about our level of social connection. So somebody who's surrounded by people, who has lots of family, lots of friends, can still be lonely, but maybe it's that they feel they don't have good quality relationships. And I suppose that's the key difference there. So maybe feeling like you don't belong, if you're constantly in contact with other people, but not feeling like you fit in, then the presence of those other people is probably not very helpful for loneliness in that case. And, people use words like feeling sad, feeling empty, painful to describe loneliness. So, it's unpleasant, which is the key difference then with another concept, solitude, which is that more pleasant experience of being alone. So I think it's helpful to kind of differentiate between sometimes these terms that might get mixed up, for us to really, I suppose, understand what loneliness is.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it? And I guess you touched on a really kind of interesting thing there, I suppose, that it's sort of invisible in a sense that you can't necessarily know if someone is feeling lonely. So that idea that you might have a lot of connections, but crucially it's about feeling maybe disconnected in them. I guess there's those kind of stereotypical images of certain age groups being physically alone and thereby lonely by definition of age and kind of, but I think it's much more kind of universal than that, isn't it? It's sort of ironic in a sense that we probably all, at more than one time in our lives, have had an experience of not fitting in or feeling very different and maybe disconnected. And that can be kind of related to loneliness in a sense, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think anybody, you've touched on it there, that anybody can feel loneliness at any point in your life. And I suppose there are times where maybe we might be more likely to feel lonely. So I think you mentioned there about, across the lifespan, if we think about our lives across, and you mentioned there about stereotypes as well, that sometimes there's a stereotypical image of somebody who feels lonely as an older person. And I suppose that's just not the case. It can happen to anybody across their lifetime. But I suppose when we look at the data across the lifespan, we see in the research that loneliness tends to follow this U-shaped pattern where, we see higher average levels of loneliness in young adults, and then also at the end of our lives in older adulthood. And I suppose if we think about why that might be, or what might make us vulnerable to loneliness across our across our lifespan, it's typically kind of those big life transitions, or I did my PhD work in younger or emerging adults who were the age group from about 18 to 25 years. And as we think about the typical life of a young adult, you've got so many transitions: finishing school, they might be beginning work or moving away to university, or navigating romantic relationships. And you've got the weakening of ties with your parents or caregivers, but you mightn't yet have established your kind of core family group yet. So it's those kind of key social transitions that can make us vulnerable to loneliness across our lifespan.
It's a big transition, isn't it? I guess that younger age group, it's so huge when you think about it, and kind of then going into college or university or work or whatever it is, it's quite a stark contrast of and maybe similar exiting kind of the work cycle as well. They're kind of maybe more thought. I don't know, maybe this is my own assumption, but more kind of there's more discussion in a sense around retirement and what that might look like as opposed to what it's like to be catapulted into the world in a sense.
Yeah, and I suppose those transitions are two very different things. And when we think about
Yep.
older adults, of course, those transitions can be things as well, like bereavement, navigating losing a spouse or your, siblings and friends. But I suppose the common thread is that they're life events that might disrupt our social connections. So if you think about a young person who finishes school and maybe moves on to work or college, that's a disruption to the social networks that they've developed in school. And then similarly for an older adult who's retiring, that's a disruption to their social networks that they've built in their workplace. So it's a similar, I suppose it's a common thread there, even though they're very different life transitions. And another thing as well that can, make us more vulnerable to loneliness across our lifespan are role changes. So if we think about becoming a parent, somebody maybe in young or middle adulthood who becomes a new parent, so that's a major transition as well, and a new role that you're taking on, and that can really affect our social relationships and our priorities for our relationships too. So it's these kind of life events that can happen to anyone, and they can make us vulnerable to loneliness. So I think it really hammers that point about the fact that Anybody really can feel lonely, and it can be related to those life circumstances.
Yeah. I think that's helpful to hear because often I guess we can be self-critical or judgmental about feeling lonely. And I guess as you say, with big changes throughout the lifespan that could kind of lead to that being a possibility. It's not a permanent state, but it's certainly a very normal one in response to those changes. So I guess anyone can feel lonely. That's a really normal human experience, and it can happen at any age, I guess we're sort of saying. And just maybe to tie into what you were saying there earlier about, um, I guess, kind of being around people and feeling that disconnection. So it might actually be unhelpful to be around people. It might exacerbate maybe some of those maybe self-critical thoughts or judgmental thoughts. And I guess that makes me think then about, I guess, so how loneliness might kind of move back and forth between mental health, I suppose, as we're thinking about today. It's quite bi-directional, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose if we think about how loneliness impacts our mental health, um, there's a broad range of ways that loneliness impacts our mental health. So I suppose if we think about loneliness and the fact that, it feels unpleasant to experience loneliness, and chronic loneliness, or that very intense, or maybe you're feeling lonely all of the time, your body is on high alert and it treats loneliness like a threat. So it can be very stressful to feel like that all the time. And that can impact our mental health. Or, for example, loneliness might, in some people, persistent loneliness might lead to depression. You might feel distress of having a long-term feeling of disconnection that moves from sadness about your social relationships to kind of sadness or distress more broadly. So that can kind of lead to depression in that sense. Or sometimes people might feel rejected or maybe unwanted when they're feeling lonely, and that can really affect how we see ourselves. So self-esteem might come in there for some people. And even things as well like sleep problems. Loneliness research suggests that loneliness disrupts our rest and our sleep. Similarly, again, I suppose your body sees loneliness as this social threat, and that can affect our sleep. So that can, of course, feed into mood and affect our mental health too. But I think it's important there what you mentioned about the fact that it's probably a bi-directional relationship, in that mental health challenges can also, feed into loneliness, or can trigger loneliness for some people. So perhaps if somebody's experiencing depression and they're experiencing social withdrawal, maybe loss of motivation, that can seep into our social relationships and maybe cause somebody to withdraw from their social relationships. And of course, that can kind of make people feel lonely. Or experiencing low mood or feeling like a burden can impact your social relationships too. So I think it's that really kind of bi-directional relationship where mental health and loneliness probably feed into each other, and they can create that cycle then that can be difficult for people to break.
Yeah. I guess it can be challenging, can't it, if you get in your own head about it, for want of making it a little bit simple in a sense. As you say, it's a really bi-directional kind of piece in it. So you might be feeling very low in mood. And we know that when people are feeling very depressed, they may have less energy, motivation to do the things they might have enjoyed. And when they do those things, those things aren't as enjoyable. And then that might lead to feeling more disconnected and lonely, which can then lead into that cycle of self-criticism. There's no point in doing it anyway. Um, maybe this isn't going to change. So it kind of feeds itself in a sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's important as well. I probably should have started with this too when we talk about loneliness and mental health, and loneliness and depression, that sometimes loneliness and depression can seem to kind of go hand in hand. But while they're related, as we mentioned, and they might overlap, maybe feeling sad or feeling down or withdrawing, they are very different
Yes.
experiences too. So I suppose with loneliness, that's a focus specifically on social connection or disconnection or relationships. Whereas depression is more, of course, a broader condition of emotional and physical symptoms. And I suppose although research suggests that they feed into each other, like we mentioned there, they are two different experiences. And I suppose somebody can feel lonely, and
Yeah.
that be a temporary experience and
Yeah.
not something that you need to seek help for necessarily, unless it's impacting your life or feeding into your mental health. But I think it's just, I suppose, important to kind of make that distinction too, that they're different
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, isn't it? As you say, so, and I think maybe what you're getting at there is about not pathologizing. Well, either one, but certainly not pathologizing loneliness as something a condition in a sense that this is a human experience, as you say, around maybe
Yeah.
disconnection, yeah, which is very normal and transient.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
for most people, especially when we talked about those transitions, like we were talking about how different points where we might feel lonely throughout our lives. For many people, loneliness is temporary or transient and might come hand in hand with maybe moving country or beginning a new job or these kind of life transitions. And, you know, for most people, loneliness will subside when you find your feet in that new workplace, or, you know, you create connections, or you kind of reconnect with people. And then there is, of course, a small, and that type of loneliness, you know, doesn't necessarily need extra, you know, support. It's entirely human to feel lonely. But for some people, of course, loneliness becomes what we call chronic, and might really impact somebody's life. And I think then, of course, people might seek support. And I think it's just about not being ashamed about feeling lonely, that it's an entirely human experience. And I think, yeah, it's nothing to be ashamed of in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, that's important, isn't it? And I guess just thinking about the research, I guess you've kind of alluded to that in a sense that the kind of it's certainly an experience across the lifespan. And I don't mean to put you on the spot here, Emma. It's more just a philosophical question about whether you think maybe we're more lonely now than we were, or are we? I guess this is a kind of perennial question, isn't it? In these kind of discussions, are we better at talking about it, or is there a change in loneliness? And maybe a bit of both. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think I'm not sure about the research for other age groups, but I know that
Yeah.
when I was doing my PhD, I saw a piece of research that came out where it looked at loneliness in emerging adults. You
Mm,
know, has that increased over time? And the the amount that it had increased was really like insignificant. Um,
okay.
and I suppose that's just one piece of research. But I think, to answer your question, I think it's probably that we're talking about it more, and we're
Yeah.
more open about sharing people's experiences. And that might make it seem like it's more common, but really it's probably that we're more open to talking about it, like having conversations like this today. We were only talking before we came on the call about how media even it has become more common to see discussions
Mm,
around loneliness in media. And I think that's a really good thing. And that, yeah, so it's probably that we're maybe talking about it a little bit more, and we're more
mm.
aware of loneliness, as opposed to it actually being more common.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I guess that, and as we're saying, kind of a lot that it can affect anyone at any age. So there's more kind of conversations, and I guess, yeah, I suppose culturally as well, it's more permission to talk about it, maybe, and acknowledge maybe that someone might have an experience of loneliness, and that's okay. I guess Ireland is a very kind of a kind of family based society as well, isn't it? And kind of connection based, and
Hmm.
certainly, I think I shared in our last webinar talking to someone about this, and when I'd moved back from the UK, and someone saying like that there's no loneliness in Ireland, that's just not an issue here because of how the society is kind of set up, and I thought that's really interesting, isn't it? So maybe we're getting better at naming this, and as a society kind of maybe tackling it. Certainly the Task Force for Loneliness and different initiatives that there's something actually we can do about it as well as describing it and naming it.
Yeah, and I think as well it's come back to that as well, that we're not pathologizing it maybe is more
Yeah.
too. So we're
Yeah.
understanding, it's really, I suppose, understanding that anybody can feel lonely at any time point, and it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. And maybe that's also feeding into our willingness maybe to talk about it a bit more and discuss loneliness and what we might be able to do for loneliness. And but yeah, I think it's interesting about that point about that Ireland doesn't experience loneliness, because actually I don't know if you saw, but in recent years we came out as top in Europe, for highest levels of loneliness in one particular poll that was.
Mm.
So but it's, I suppose it's maybe that we're becoming more open to talking about it, as opposed to that, you know, maybe that it never existed. But I think that sense of
Mm.
community is really important as well when we think about loneliness.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess there's possibly different causes, as you've sort of spoken about, of why someone might feel lonely. And I suppose social media comes up a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And probably very mixed research around that. I guess if someone's, and maybe I know that people watch these webinars, maybe who might be having, experiencing their own challenges, or maybe they're watching kind of for a teenager or a young person. I guess what would you kind of as a kind of expert view, kind of giving that sense of the research around social media, or kind of that kind of use and
Yeah.
its interaction with loneliness?
I think when we mention loneliness and young people, automatically the next nearly
Yeah, yeah.
topic conversation is social media. Um, but I think it's important to acknowledge that some people do have really meaningful connections on social media. So I suppose it's not all bad. I know sometimes there can be a lot of concern, really, I suppose, around social media, but the link between social media and loneliness is probably not as straightforward as more time you spend on social media means that you experience more loneliness. It's probably a little bit more complicated. We need to think about things like people's motivations for using social media and also how they're using it. So when we think about social media use, there's active use, which is where you post and you're commenting and you're messaging and you're engaging with, maybe the social connections that you have in the real world. And then passive use is where we might sit and scroll on TikTok or Instagram Reels and we're just consuming content, but we're not actually interacting. And the research suggests that it's individuals who passively use social media, so maybe spending a lot of time just scrolling, that are maybe more likely to experience feelings of loneliness. And I suppose it makes sense if we think about using social media as an extension of our in-person relationships or to connect with people maybe who've moved abroad or family abroad. It kind of makes sense, I suppose, when you think about it in that way, that might necessarily lead to more loneliness because we're using it as a tool to connect with people. It's more, I suppose, if you're substituting the time that you might spend on your in-person connections or your social relationships with scrolling on social media. So I suppose that's an important distinction there when we think about social media. And also the motivation for somebody's use. So if somebody is maybe using social media to compensate for their lack of in-person relationships or to compensate because maybe they don't feel they have relationships, that then obviously it is probably related to greater loneliness. So I think it's more it's less about how much we use it, but how we're using it, I suppose, is the key aspect there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, isn't it? So it's the kind of function of the behavior, to give a very psychology sort of term to it, isn't it? And yeah, and I guess you yourself wouldn't be the best judge of that, wouldn't you? The individual kind of thinking, okay, so I've lost an hour there to nothing versus I've caught up with someone in New Zealand. I mean, that's very
Yeah.
obvious. But
Yeah.
I guess well, we're all at risk potentially of losing that time. So I suppose maybe there's something, I guess there's a question there maybe that ties into this, like, okay, so like what can we do about loneliness? And I think there's like a multifaceted answer to that. Maybe starting with the individual in terms of things that maybe even noticing that use. I think that's a really good way you describe it,
Yeah.
is that is the social media a substitution for those connections, and maybe not intentionally, maybe they aren't there. So it's wanting to connect somewhere. Um
Yeah, and I think it's about remembering as well that, and I'm going to use social media as an example, but like it's not your fault also. Like
yeah.
I suppose with social media, particularly, I don't know if anybody's seen that documentary on Netflix, but they are literally designed to keep us engaged and to keep
Mm,
us, scrolling. And so they put so much thought into keeping us there. So and it happens to the best of us. You get lost in your phone and your next thing an hour has gone by and you don't even
yeah.
realize. And so I suppose it's not, it's a wider issue than ourselves. But I suppose what you mentioned
Yeah.
there about maybe noticing how it makes you feel too is of course
Yeah.
important. Like how do you feel when you spend time on social media? I know for myself, I delete my Instagram sometimes because you get
Mm,
sick of social media. And I
true.
think that stuff like that can be helpful, just noticing how it makes you feel. So that can be important.
Yeah. And I guess what else individually do you think? I suppose, and I'm holding in mind as well, as you say, loneliness and depression are different kind of areas. So it's not what's going to work for one may not work for the other in a sense,
Yeah.
but there probably is a level of needing some level of self-awareness, whether that's kind of noticing how you feel, maybe noticing kind of some of the predictions or thoughts you might have about connections. I don't know. Do you want to speak a little bit about that? That might be
Yeah. So
helpful for people.
yeah, and I think yeah, so I suppose for loneliness, like we all feel lonely sometimes, and there can be loads of reasons why people feel lonely. And I suppose, like you mentioned there, that there can be wider systemic issues that are kind of out of control of the individual. But there are some things that we can do to kind of help ourselves a little bit, maybe feel a bit better if we're feeling lonely. So I suppose something that can be really helpful is deciding how much social connection that you actually want in your life without judgment. So I suppose being kind to yourself as well while you're thinking about this. But I suppose, how much social connection do you want in your life versus maybe what you think you want or what you see other people have? So it's really about, I suppose, being in tune with what you yourself, what matters to you. We mentioned there at the start of this that loneliness is really individual. So, it's helpful to kind of think about yourself. What social connection would I like, and what type of social connection? So there's different types of loneliness. You might miss the buzz of a social group, or the kind of casual social contact that you get in the workplace or with a team, let's say if you play sports. Or you might be missing that really close friend, that kind of close, intimate relationship that you get with a close friend or a family member or a partner. So I suppose it's about thinking about maybe what type of connection that you want as well. And they're just some questions that can help identify, I suppose, what it is that people are feeling lonely for. And then that's kind of a small step towards, understanding what might help make you feel better. Which I think can be helpful.
Yeah, and I think that's great, isn't it? Again, that kind of comes back to that self-reflection piece, maybe, and because it's so interesting, as you say, it never really occurred to me to think that, yeah, what would you actually want, as opposed to maybe getting lost in that feeling of loneliness, because it can be overwhelming, can't it? And
Yeah.
it can be consuming in a sense when it's there. So, and maybe there can be a lot of comparisons as well. Like, so this is not to kind of play that social media card again, but like I should be doing X or Y because that's what I see. And I know everyone doesn't think that, but maybe it's that kind of yeah, kind of more open reflection with yourself about what do I need, what do I
Yeah,
want, and also maybe what am I in a space to manage at the moment? What's going to be the right
absolutely.
fit for now?
Yeah, I think there when you mentioned about the social comparison, and I know I'll come back to social media again, but I think that is something that can be really difficult for people, is comparing yourself to others and the amount of social contact that other people have. But actually it's about, well, what do I want, or what what you know exactly, like, what am I in a position to, what would make me feel a little bit better? And it's about taking small steps too, not about going out tomorrow and being the most social person, but taking a small step that maybe you might go and work in a co-working space or work from a cafe, that kind of like being alone together piece that some people can find helpful. So I suppose it's not about changing, making huge changes overnight, but just small steps even can be helpful.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, isn't it? There's a question in here which I think maybe ties in slightly and maybe complicates it a little bit, but in terms of maybe social anxiety and loneliness. So we spoke a bit about depression, but also maybe that, yeah, when there can be a lot of anxiety around those connections and being in social spaces that can be really hard, that might have the result then of creating or adding to an experience of loneliness as well as
Yeah.
the anxiety.
Of course, yeah, yes, of course. If somebody's feeling like, maybe anxious about going out and making social connections, or even, I suppose, interacting with their social relationships, that can be really difficult and can exacerbate loneliness. And I think that's where digital connections shouldn't be dismissed, or social media, shouldn't be dismissed, because for some people who maybe find, going out and socializing like that really challenging, that's where social media and those digital connections can be really valuable for somebody like that. So I think it's about, I suppose, understanding what's the right fit for you in this moment, and not kind of comparing with all the time with other people as well. Because we're all individuals and people have different preferences and needs, and I think that's important. So
Yeah. It's important to remember, isn't it? Yeah, and different needs maybe around different times as well. So I'm just even thinking about our support group. So we have them in person, but we also have them virtually, and people really get benefits from both. Obviously, it can be that bit safer maybe to be in your own home and do that and make that connection and find that peer support. And maybe the group is something you get to in person. Maybe it's not, as you say, that all of it's valid. It's about kind of maybe what connection is going to be helpful for you in that time.
yeah, I think as well, like with online connection, it's, most people will find that it's a mix that works for them, online connection
Yeah.
and in-person connection. That's, I mean, many of us are on social media, and that's kind of the way that we live. Many people live lives nowadays. But I suppose online connection as well can lead to offline connection. So maybe some support groups that start out as an online group that kind of might lead to in-person too. So I suppose it is just that mix of whatever
Yeah.
is somebody's preference.
Yeah, and I guess thinking about it from a CBT lens, in a sense, it might be quite understandable to have a lot of anxious predictions about what's going to go on in that group, and how it's going to be. So to be in that virtually can maybe dispel some of them and give a different experience. So it can, for if it's appropriate, can scaffold to getting in person if that's what the person wants to do. I suppose it gives a bit of a sense, doesn't it, of what it could be like.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so yeah, I guess it's not throwing out the digital bathwater as it was
Yeah.
as a phrase, but doing maybe what's going to be helpful. Um, just looking at some more of the questions here, there kind of is an interesting one about kind of different age groups. Um, this is interesting. I'm going to read it out in terms of this person's noticing that a lot of people in their early 20s are anxious about phoning people and opt instead to text. Do you think that impacts on ability to connect? Um,
That's interesting. Yeah, I suppose it's maybe my honest answer is I'm not sure that impacts, but I think it's about personal preference too. I suppose if somebody prefers to have a phone call and have that conversation where you can hear a person's tone, but I think it's probably what's the norm as well for particular age groups. So I suppose it's that also comes into it, that for people who prefer to text, or it's particularly I suppose younger age groups, that has kind of become the norm, and that's the way that people can express themselves now. But yeah, it's an interesting point about whether that has impacts
Yeah,
on
I
that.
guess it's hard to know, isn't it? It'd be yeah, I don't know what the research is like in that area, as you say, but I guess it's what's going to be right for you as well. So I guess some people of all ages really don't like the phone at all, regardless, and some people really do. So I
Yeah.
suppose it's kind of tuning into your own needs, isn't it? Um, and I guess then maybe just thinking about another question there. And maybe we've touched a bit on that, but just kind of coming back to that, social anxiety can feed a bit of that loneliness and kind of keeping away from people, kind of maybe for fear of what might happen. I think we slightly talked about that, and maybe kind of
Yeah.
steps and thinking about what might be a slightly easier step into things. Maybe would you agree? Or
Yeah, so I suppose I think like for people it's probably as well try, and I know I keep coming back to this about how it's so individual, but I suppose it's like trying different approaches. So, maybe if somebody finds it's about finding, I suppose, like low pressure situations where you might be able to connect with people. So that might be deciding to go to your local cafe where you're not meeting anybody, you're going, and it's kind of that being alone together, and you might have a brief interaction with the barista maybe, and that's one step. And then that's a small step that somebody might be able to take, is go and do something like that, and then you're not putting yourself into really high pressure situations where you're kind of
yeah,
forced to have social contact. So it's about
mm,
finding what's right for you, and not, it's small steps, not pushing yourself too far either,
yeah.
because we don't need to do anything overnight. It's small steps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I would kind of add into that kind of recording those wins, because they're easy to forget, aren't they? Where our mind has a negative bias kind of
Hmm.
um bent in a sense. So kind of maybe making a note of where you have done that, or kind of yeah, kind of holding it in
Yeah.
mind. And I guess there's another question there, which I think is interesting, about kind of cultural differences regarding communicating about loneliness, which I think is really key. And maybe there's something there in terms of what you mentioned a bit earlier. So what we might maybe in not always being so obvious. Someone might be surrounded by people but still feel very lonely. So
Mm.
what I guess if you're worried about someone, or kind of someone in your life you're wondering, and maybe if you're a health professional, what you might listen out for. Um,
Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, loneliness, and that's the real challenge with loneliness in research, and as well, I can imagine for clinicians, that, it's not something that is visible in somebody else. So we're relying on people either telling us or kind of giving us signs maybe that they're feeling lonely. So I suppose things like people withdrawing, loneliness can make people withdraw, become less social and kind of more withdrawn. So that could be maybe one kind of particular kind of behavioral aspect of loneliness, or, you know, mood changes like somebody feeling down or feeling disconnected, or even kind of using self-deprecating language or negative comments about their capabilities, and particularly, I suppose, in social situations or social relationships. But I suppose it's important then to caveat that it's important to remember that somebody can be really socially active but still be feeling lonely internally. So I suppose it's just, that's kind of a challenge with loneliness. But I suppose for people who's maybe are concerned about a friend feeling lonely, I suppose like simple check-ins, like how are you doing, as opposed to being kind of confronting somebody with, okay, tell me, are you lonely? Or kind of being honest, you know, I noticed that you're a little bit quieter recently, or, you know, you haven't been kind of coming out with us, or you're just wondering, you know, how you're doing, things like that. But I suppose it's giving people the space too, that maybe they don't want to talk about that. We're getting better at talking about loneliness, but there is still mostly it's nearly a self stigma, you know, to do with loneliness. For people, it can be challenging to maybe admit that they're feeling lonely for fear that people will perceive them negatively. So it's kind of giving people space to not to be, I suppose, forcing people to have to talk about it if maybe they're just not ready to talk about it. And I think being mindful of assumptions too, that if somebody's feeling lonely, it's not necessarily that they want more social contact all of the time. It might be that they just feel a little bit disconnected, or they're not feeling like they fit in. So, you know, giving people low pressure situations to join in social contact, or, you know, I'm going for a coffee if you want to join me, but no worries if not, or I'm going for a walk, kind of, I suppose not everybody wants more social contact is what I'm trying to say. I suppose that so some people might just want to be listened to or heard. So I suppose maybe avoiding jumping in to try and fix somebody's loneliness, and maybe just being there for people can be helpful.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? The not trying to fix, or not kind of having assumptions that if someone's not doing a huge amount with people, that must mean that they're lonely. That might apply to different age groups as well. I guess there's something about kind of being open to hearing how they feel, if they want to share that, and then kind of thinking about what could be helpful, as opposed to, okay, we need to get you out into a club or do this or that. Like, that may not be what the
Yeah.
person wants at all.
And maybe even asking people, because I'm briefly touched on it earlier, but, you know, there are different types of loneliness. So somebody might be maybe feeling that they don't have a wider social group, like the type of that you might get with hobbies, or, you know, if you play sports on a team. Or that person might be feeling like they don't have the close confidant or the close friend. So, you know, it's about, and if somebody feels that they don't have that close friend, then them going out and joining a football team tomorrow is, you know, might necessarily. So it's just, it's individual.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to maybe asking people what it is, that if they'd like help with something, or something in particular, can probably be
Yeah,
helpful.
I think that makes sense. Yeah. And I guess kind of slightly related to that, there's a comment here, which I think is I guess is interesting in terms of the relationship to alcohol and Irish culture kind of maybe being predicated around pubs. And I suppose maybe it ties back into saying, it's also quite individual. I think there's also different things that you can do and look into. There's a whole, I would argue, a whole world outside pubs. Maybe it's
Yeah.
about, as you said, kind of what is your need here and what are your interests, and maybe letting that guide. Um,
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, and I know it's easy to say, if you're feeling only, go out and start a load of hobbies, and that's not realistic for everybody.
yeah.
But I suppose it's about finding maybe something that you're really interested in, and straight away that's a conversation starter with somebody else. You know, if you join, I don't know, a choir, and you're both there for the same reason, you're both interested in the same thing, straight away that's something that you have in common with somebody else. That can be a nice way of social relationships. Or I know lots of the research would advise around volunteering, because it's, you're kind of doing something that feels good for yourself, and then you're also, you might have meet social contacts, and I know that that's not realistic for everybody, but they can be ways that people can kind of find groups where you have something in common with other people.
Yeah, yeah. And that's going to make it easier, isn't it, to kind of be in the space together and have that shared topic of conversation. It's a bit more accessible, maybe.
Yeah.
And if it's task focused, I think that can be easier, as opposed to going for a coffee with somebody.
Yeah.
If you're around a certain task, it's a bit easier maybe to.
Bit lower pressure. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, maybe not as much expectation on you. A couple of so there's loads of questions actually as we suspected, which is great. So my apologies if we don't get to your specific question. We'll do our best and maybe take some of the themes and some of them we may not be able to answer fully, but certainly kind of give food for thought. Um, there's a one here about technology. Well, two kind of on technology in a sense. So one is around online dating, and kind of maybe people describing it, they can feel lonelier, maybe through talking to a lot of people, but no organic or real connection. So that's, I guess maybe that kind of goes back to something around the idea about kind of how you use it or what the impact is.
Yeah, I think it's probably as well that I suppose if with online dating and if you're kind of messaging lots of people, I suppose they're really superficial relationships because I suppose you
Yeah,
haven't really gotten to know that person yet, and there's maybe not that connection there. So it's kind of a, yeah, I suppose a more superficial relationship. So I suppose that can be challenging, and I suppose it's important to maybe um kind of complement that type of interaction with then the in-person,
yeah,
interaction with somebody, that kind of deeper connection. So I suppose it comes back to, I suppose, social media. It's about not replacing the in-person or kind of deeper conversations or the social contact that you have with this
yeah,
online contact, but that they, for many people, they find a mix works okay. So I suppose that's
sure.
kind of,
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, isn't it? Because I guess that can become a time eater in a sense, maybe for people. So it's kind of having those real life connections as well, or more substantive connections, whether they're virtual or not. And maybe that ties on to what someone else is saying here, which I often wonder about. Is there a contribution of loneliness maybe when a lot of the world's activities have moved online, like shopping, banking, dating, everything, I guess, in a sense, it can maybe, excuse me, lead to not needing to interact with another person in terms of our day-to-day
yeah.
lives.
It's those, because it's those weak ties as well that are really important, that kind of
Mm,
the social contact that you have with the cashier in your local shop, or with the same barista that gives you your coffee. Those kind of weak ties can be really important for people. And I think I know we had discussions about kind of working from home, and that's a similar kind of
mm,
if people are doing a lot of remote working, you're missing out on those, although they're brief, but you're missing out on those interactions with a colleague at the coffee station, or the person sitting next to you at your desk. And I suppose when everything moves online, we lose that brief social connection or
mm,
interaction during the day. So I suppose if somebody feels that they're doing a lot of stuff online, because I know myself, I work from home a lot, it's about being really intentional then with seeking social contact if that's what you need. So for example, going out one day and getting a coffee out, or doing kind of being, you have to be a little bit more intentional, I think, with your social contact when everything has moved online. Absolutely.
yeah. I guess intentional is kind of the key there, isn't it? That you're kind of maybe making those choices. And I suppose that maybe makes me think we talked a little bit, didn't we, about kind of AI, and I suppose a lot of the use of AI is around relationships. I guess getting support on managing relationships, but also inadvertently and maybe very quickly, people are now building relationships with AI chatbots.
Yeah. Yeah, I think absolutely, because I suppose when AI chatbots are designed to mimic human interaction, I suppose, when people interact with them. And I suppose the research on AI kind of appears to be a bit mixed, and it's still emerging because those chatbots are relatively new, I suppose. But I suppose where the main concern with AI might be is that if somebody is seeking human connection, but they're using the chatbots as their way of, I suppose, achieving that connection. And like chatbots, I suppose, are not a real human, and they can't, I suppose, experience real empathy. They're designed
Mm,
to keep you engaged, and they simulate human interaction, but I suppose it's not that real human connection. And I suppose if people are becoming dependent on AI chatbots, then they miss out on, authentic human experiences and relationships, and dealing with conflict and getting, genuine support from a friend or from somebody else. So I suppose it might be helpful as a, again, it might be helpful as a mix to your
mm.
everyday or your in-person interactions, but it's just a concern, I suppose, when that type of interaction becomes a replacement for, human
Yeah.
relationships.
And I
Yeah.
guess that's the kind of message that you're giving, Emma. It sounds like it's about not replacing. those
I
connections,
think so.
maybe in different
Yeah,
formats. It's interesting. There's a slight aside, though. I wonder because AI is developing at such pace, isn't it? I remember I was having this conversation with friends recently that will there get to be a point where it doesn't matter, that it'll be such a good simulation of an empathic other that it won't matter. I don't know. Like I'm not saying that you would know the
yeah.
answer to that, but it's or is that where it's going to go?
I
That
hope
people
not.
actually won't mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Um,
Yeah, it's interesting. It's definitely interesting. And I suppose another thing with AI as well is because when I was doing a little bit of reading on this, is that people have experience where they've created this relationship with their AI chatbot and then it updates and
yeah.
it becomes different. So there's that risk as well that, of course, over time people change, but not to the same extent that, you could have an
Mhm.
update in the AI chatbot. So I think there's all these kind of different risks with it, but it's a really interesting area. Definitely,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think it is, I guess, and even I find that fascinating as well, the level of devastation and loss when that update happened. Like
yeah,
people had built, and I think to me that speaks to a real human need to connect, just in a
yeah,
sense that we're really seeking that out, maybe. So it's not really that surprising that maybe we are experiencing loneliness and that's part of that kind of connection piece. I suppose it's maybe as we're talking about today, like what we can do about it
yeah,
and maybe how we might support other people as well. Because there's an interesting question there that I thought was um where is it now? So someone that was saying that they are quite happy in their own company after retiring. Is
yeah,
that likely to change? And I guess it's a sort of a broad question, isn't it? Maybe other people might be more worried. I don't know about this question, but maybe it kind of goes back to our assumptions again, doesn't it? Just because looking at the outside of people's lives, we can't know either to say that they are feeling lonely or that they're not, or that they should because their stage of life means
yeah.
that they will. Maybe they won't as well, you know?
It's about individual needs and wants. Like
Yeah.
many people are really happy in their own company, and I think it's well, even when we think about relationships that people have, it's not necessarily about the quantity, but
Mm.
the quality. So many people are really happy in their own company and they might have one or two close relationships and that they're perfectly happy with that and they're really satisfied and that's absolutely perfect. There's no need for somebody, you shouldn't feel that you need, it's again that
Yeah.
comparison piece, I think, too, about
Mm.
comparing yourself with others. Um, and I know even that there's, people talk about whether introverts or extroverts are more likely to be lonely. And, um, people can be introverted and be perfectly happy with that. There's, you
Mm.
don't need that kind of social contact all the time or lots of social relationships. So I think it is just really a personal really a kind of a personal needs and wants and your experience then.
Yeah, I think that's really important, isn't it? You can't kind of know based on other people's
No.
experiences or comparing or maybe what other people think you should be feeling. Someone's mentioned social prescribing in there as well, so that's another helpful kind of intervention that's available. Um, and I guess I wonder about other kind of maybe that we haven't covered yet, maybe that Emma, that if you think that we've missed in terms of what people could do or other kind of supports or that yeah, as I said, that we haven't
Yeah,
said already.
I suppose we kind of touched briefly on kind of like, I suppose, like trying different approaches. So for some people, what might work is a group that you can keep going back to, that you can build meaningful connections over time with. So that might be a hobby or even like a fitness class or something like that. We mentioned, I know, briefly about volunteering. And as well, I suppose, like reconnecting with, we talked a lot, I suppose, I talked a lot about building new connections, but there's also, reconnecting with people that are already in your life. So picking up the phone and calling a cousin or an aunt or a friend, or texting if you prefer to text.
Mhm.
But those, kind of reconnecting with your existing social relationships can be helpful for people too. If going out and making new ones might feel like a big step. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess there's a comment in there about kind of that maybe speaks to the quality of relationships as well. So I guess that's kind of a personal thing, isn't it? You might make choices about whether you want to continue certain relationships if they feel healthy and helpful or maybe not. I guess that's a personal decision, but I suppose it's again it's as you say, Emma, that kind of individual piece and thinking about what's going to be right for you and what small
Mhm.
steps might be possible.
Yeah, I suppose like relationships that you're not happy in or that you don't feel good around people, like of course that can also lead to loneliness too, because you're maybe not getting the satisfaction from that relationship that you might want. So
Yeah,
yeah, so again, it's just not just about the quantity or the presence of people, but
yeah.
like how you're connecting and how you feel around people too.
Yeah, I think that's so important, isn't it? And certainly in my clinical work, I guess the level of loneliness that people in intimate relationships might describe, or very long-term relationships. And I guess from the outside, things might look okay, but actually one of those two can feel very lonely. So I guess there's kind of that normalizing that this is something that can happen as part of that experience,
Mhm.
at any point and within different relationships. Um, okay. So I guess thank you for all the questions that have come in. Hopefully we've done justice to many of them. There's just one last one here actually. I think is another interesting one about this kind of goes back to our AI potentially too, in terms of about the lack of physical touch. Can that lead to loneliness? I think that's really important actually, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe someone who's experienced a bereavement or maybe is kind of having that disconnection. I think it's quite key, isn't it? I suppose that the kind of capacity for touch.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it's an aspect of real human connection that is really important. I suppose if you're missing that, or that's something that you're wanting, that of course can feed into loneliness too. And that's something that we can't get through social media or through
Yeah,
AI chatbots or stuff like that. So I suppose that's something that's unique to um in-person human connection.
yeah, yeah. And maybe it speaks to your point earlier about kind of thinking for yourself about what are you lonely for?
Yeah,
And that being a kind of reflection piece. So is it that kind of contact? Is it the kind of more deeper friendship, or is it about kind of feeling being in the world or connecting with people in different ways? So kind of really exploring that before you kind of go and say, okay, this is what I should do about it.
yeah,
Uh,
I think so.
yeah. Okay. So yeah, as I said, thank you all for the questions. Kind of coming towards the end of the time, I suppose. I guess, and we've touched on a lot of areas, Emma. So thank you so much in terms of your expertise and your experience here. Hopefully, um, you feel that we've been able to cover enough, I suppose, to give people a bit of food for thought. And I guess, yeah, maybe for me, kind of it's really helpful to think about how normal this is. And
Yeah,
there are things you can do, but they're going to be quite unique and specific to you, I think. It's not for us to say do X, Y, and Z. That's going to solve loneliness. It's quite specific to the individual. Um, what do you think in terms of what would you kind of most want people to take away with them from our conversation today, or what would you even kind of want to summarize in a sense?
yeah, I think we've touched on loads, and hopefully that was kind of a nice overview. And thanks everybody for the questions as well. Um, I suppose like yeah, I think what's an important message is that like loneliness is a human experience. You touched on it there. That if you're feeling lonely, that nobody's weak or you're not broken or flawed or it's not your fault. It's an experience that signals our human need for connection. So yeah, and I think then of course what comes with how an individual loneliness is that there's no single right way to address or to fix loneliness. And I suppose we've touched on different things here today, but it might require a little bit of trial and error as well. It's such an individual experience,
Mm.
and it's really about understanding, I suppose, what your needs are, and finding out what works for people individually.
Yeah, that's great. Absolutely. And I guess if you think of any specific resources that people might find helpful, we can certainly include them in our email after the webinar as well. So
Perfect.
sort of books, or because again there's loads of different experiences. So it's going to be in literature, but also in kind of more practical things as well. So anything that's of interest to people, we can include in our follow up. So I guess Emma, just to say thank you again so much. Really appreciate your time today. I think it's been a really interesting conversation and really appreciate your expertise in this. So thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. And thank you all for joining as well and all the questions. As I said, hopefully we got to as many of them as was helpful. Maybe you are left with anything, maybe speaking to a GP or mental health professional if it relates specifically to your own mental health. And just moving then to the webinar for next month. So that is the 8th of October, celebrating our 40th birthday here at Aware that week. So we're going to be talking about what does mental health recovery mean. So some really interesting guest panelists for that as well. So really, if you can join us, that would be great. So looking forward to seeing you then. So just to say thank you all for joining this afternoon. Thanks again, Emma, and I'll see you all next month, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.